I walked into my ex-husband's funeral after 10 years of silence. My daughters looked away like I was a stranger. But when the lawyer read his will, every eye turned back to me. And what he left behind, it changed everything. Stay with me. Because this story will show you what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried, especially when it's worth $480,000. When Evelyn stepped into the church that morning, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't just the hush that followed the creak of the heavy doors closing behind her. It was the way people turned slowly, deliberately, as though watching something unexpected unfold. A few gasped. Others leaned in to whisper the sort of whispers sharp enough to cut skin. She knew this moment would come the second she decided to attend, but knowing didn't soften the sting. 10 years had passed since most of the faces in that room had seen her, and now here she was, the ex-wife at the funeral. The scent of lilies and old wood filled her lungs as she moved down the aisle. Her black dress clung to her frame in quiet defiance of time, and though her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a neat twist, a few strands escaped, softened by the humid Charleston morning. Her heels clicked softly against the stone floor, the only sound punctuating the thick silence. If grief had a courtroom, this was it. And she was on trial. She didn't look at them. Not the ones who narrowed their eyes. Not the ones who murmured her name like it was a curse. She kept her eyes ahead and her spine straight, not out of pride but preservation. At the front of the church, the casket lay open, mahogany, and excessive, just like Richard had always preferred. Even in death he was polished. His gray suit was pressed, his hands folded neatly over his chest. It was the same posture he'd held during so many dinner table arguments. Calm, unreadable, detached. Claire sat closest to the casket, flanked by her carefully selected allies. Her black dress was tailored, her makeup pristine, her grief rehearsed. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that, as far as Evelyn could see, remained perfectly dry. Beside her sat Lily and Grace, Evelyn's daughters. Their daughters. Though you'd never know it by how they looked, through her nod at her. Lily always. Her father's reflection kept her gaze low, her posture stiff. Grace, more tender, more complicated, fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, casting one glance toward Evelyn before turning away. The rejection wasn't new, it still landed like ice in her throat. She chose a pew at the back, careful not to rustle the coat she folded beside her. Her hands remained still in her lap, her breathing measured. She told herself she hadn't come for anyone but herself. Not for Lily, not even for Grace. Though she still dreamed sometimes of what it might feel like to hold them close again. She came because this was the ending she never got. The one he took from her when he walked away and never looked back. The minister's voice rose, reading a psalm that spoke of peace and rest. Though Evelyn doubted there was much peace to be had when a life left so many splinters behind. People cried, Claire sniffled. A woman Evelyn didn't recognize sobbed audibly in the front row. Evelyn felt nothing. Not rage, not relief. Just the subtle ache of something final. She found herself staring at the casket again. 10 years ago, she'd imagined confronting Richard one last time, not with fire, but with truth. And now here he lay, no longer capable of hearing anything she might have said. Closure rarely came the way we wanted. The service moved on in its solemn rhythm. Speeches, songs, the slow march of sanitized mourning. And then a shift. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped to the front. He carried a thin leather folder and a presence that silenced even the sniffles. Evelyn recognized him. Thomas Greer. Richard's longtime estate attorney. She hadn't seen him since the divorce, but his face was exactly as she remembered. Neutral professional, unreadable. "I've been asked," he began, voice clear and clipped, to read a portion of Mr. Richard Whitman's final will and testament. The room froze. Evelyn could feel the air tighten around her like a noose. Claire adjusted in her seat. Lily blinked, suddenly more alert. Grace turned her head toward the sound, curious but guarded. Thomas opened the folder with deliberate care. His fingers paused at a page, then began to read. To Evelyn Whitman. The name hit the room like thunder. Every head turned. Every eye found her, some with confusion, some with disbelief, some with the thinly veiled contempt of people who believed the past should stay buried. Even Grace looked stunned. Lily's jaw clenched. Claire did not move, but Evelyn saw it. The quick, involuntary twitch in her jawline, the way her knuckles whitened around her clutch. Evelyn did not react. She didn't shift in her seat or lift her chin in defiance. She simply exhaled, long and slow, like someone who'd been holding her breath for a very, very long time. Whatever came next, she was ready. Because when you've been erased for a decade, sometimes the loudest kind of justice is simply hearing your name spoken again. Before the silence, before the distance, before the folded hands in a casket, there was a bookstore. They lived above it in a modest 2-bedroom apartment with creaky floors and windows that whistled when the wind got pushy, the kind of place where Evelyn would wake to the smell of ink and dust and coffee brewing downstairs. Richard used to joke that they were poor enough to be romantic. And back then, he wasn't wrong. They were broke. Yes, but they were full of beginnings. Evelyn painted. Mostly small canvases propped up on the kitchen counter, light streaming through the window onto her hands stained with ochre and sea green. She painted to stay grounded, to stay sane, to remind herself she was more than someone's partner, more than just a future mother, Richard. Meanwhile, worked on spreadsheets late into the night trying to build his financial consulting business from nothing but charm and stubbornness. They shared ramen dinners and grand visions. Sometimes on Friday nights they'd drink cheap wine and talk about where they'd go when they had real money, Paris maybe, or a quiet cabin by a lake. Evelyn always dreamed of a garden. Something wild not trimmed into submission. Hydrangeas ivy color bleeding into color. They married one April afternoon. It wasn't elaborate, just a small chapel, a store-bought cake, and a few friends who showed up for the promise, not the party. Evelyn wore her mother's dress altered by hand. Richard couldn't stop smiling, and when he whispered, "We'll build something beautiful," she believed him, and in many ways they did. Years passed. The business grew. Clients came. Money followed slow at first, then faster. They moved into a real house in Charleston, the kind with crown molding and squeaky staircases that needed work. Evelyn designed the interior herself. Soft earth tones, functional corners, nothing too flashy. She planted hydrangeas in the backyard just like she'd always dreamed. The first year, they barely bloomed. By the third, they were unruly and perfect. That house became their canvas. Baby pictures lined the hallway, crayon scribbles taped to the fridge. A clay dog Grace made in 2nd grade that always sat a little crooked on the mantel. They weren't flashy, but they were solid. Rooted Evelyn stayed home with the girls. Lily always curious and clever. Grace sensitive to noise but bold with color. Evelyn taught them to read before kindergarten. She packed homemade lunches with silly notes inside. She ran the PTA meetings with quiet competence and learned how to make Halloween costumes with nothing but fabric glue and late-night patience. When Richard came home from meetings, Evelyn had dinner warm and waiting. When he traveled, she slipped notes into his luggage, little reminders that he mattered. He didn't always say thank you. Sometimes he barely noticed, but she didn't do it for applause. She did it because she believed that's what building a life meant, showing up when no one was looking. Her paintings became gifts, then background pieces, then sometimes just tucked under the bed. She never complained. She was needed and she told herself that was enough. She was the spine of the home, though no one pointed to her name when they spoke of success. When people saw their family, they saw Richard's tailored suits, his charming presence at galas, the new SUV parked in the driveway. They saw what he had become, what she had helped him become. And Evelyn never minded, not really until she did. But back then in those early years, there was love. There were Sunday pancakes, bedtime stories, garden soil under her nails, laughter in the kitchen, evenings where Richard would kiss her on the cheek and tell her, "You're the best decision I ever made." She held those words close like loose change in a pocket, comforting even when no one else could see it. The world gave Richard credit, but Evelyn built the world. She was the one who remembered birthdays and dental appointments, who handled tantrums and packed for family trips. She was the one who watched the corners, smoothed the sharp edges, held space for everyone else to breathe, and when the silence began to settle, slow, creeping, invisible. At first, she didn't recognize it as neglect. Not yet. She just thought it was the natural drift of a long marriage that love, like paint, sometimes needed a second coat to hold, but that's later. For now, in this part of the memory, she is young. She is tired. Yes, but full. Her daughters are still small enough to believe she knows everything. Richard still calls her darling when he walks through the door. The garden still blooms. And Evelyn, she is still visible. It wasn't the first time Evelyn felt invisible, but it was the first time it felt permanent. The gala was held at one of those luxury hotels downtown, the kind with grand staircases and walls that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. The invitation had arrived weeks ago embossed in gold, naming Richard as the keynote honoree. Evelyn had tucked it on the fridge beside a fading photo of Grace in her college dorm, unsure if she would attend, but she did not. Out of obligation, not even out of hope, but out of habit. The kind of habit that forms after decades of being someone's support beam. You don't expect applause, you don't demand credit, you just show up quietly again and again. She'd spent the afternoon preparing. She took out the midnight blue dress, fitted but soft, the one Richard once said made her look like she belonged on the cover of a jazz album. She steamed it carefully, brushed off a few years of dust. The necklace he had given her for their 20th anniversary still gleamed faintly. She curled her hair the way he used to like it, loose and effortless, with just enough spray to hold it together. As they walked into the ballroom, Richard pulled ahead. He always did that. At these things walked faster, shook hands, first slipped into conversations, like he'd never left them. Evelyn followed 2 steps behind, scanning the crowd, smiling politely. She found a seat near the edge of the room, one foot tucked under the other, holding her wine glass in both hands to keep from fidgeting. Richard was in his element, laughing, confident, charming. His voice carried. Every time someone clapped him on the back or called him the man of the hour, Evelyn felt that familiar mix of pride and dislocation. He was the star. She was the stagehand. It had always been that way, hadn't it? Still, she didn't resent it. Not at first. She had built this life with him, brick by quiet brick. She had believed in his dream when it was still just scribbles on napkins. She had packed his lunches, listened to every early pitch, sat in the back of rooms where he spoke and smiled when he forgot to mention her name. She had learned to live in the pauses, the spaces in between his spotlight, and then it happened. Evelyn had been standing just behind a small group of his colleagues, mostly men in suits that cost more than her monthly grocery budget, when a senior executive from a partner firm approached. Richard, smiling broadly, gestured toward her casually and said, "Oh, and that's Evelyn. She keeps me sane." The men laughed, that polite, condescending kind of laugh that cushions casual disregard. Evelyn smiled, because that's what you do. Her hand lifted instinctively for a handshake, but hovered awkwardly midair when no one reached back. She let it drop. She stood there frozen in a dress that suddenly felt too tight in shoes that pinched her toes with a glass of wine she could no longer taste. Just someone who keeps him sane, like a houseplant or a white noise machine. Not my wife. Not the woman who raised our children. Not the one who built this life with me. Just someone who soothed his edges. She laughed too, because there was nothing else to do. But inside, something small and vital curled in on itself. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Richard took the stage. The applause was warm. He delivered his speech, confident, rehearsed, polished. He thanked his colleagues, his mentors, the board, even his high school economics teacher. He never once mentioned Evelyn. Not her name, not a glance, not a nod. And that, more than the offhand joke, more than the forgotten handshake, was what stayed with her. On the drive home, the car was quiet. The city passed by in glowing streaks, taillights, traffic signals. neon reflections in puddles from a rain that had stopped just before they left. Evelyn stared out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. At a red light, she asked softly, "Did you mean what you said tonight? About me just keeping you sane?" Richard didn't look away from his phone. His thumb moved steadily, scrolling through congratulatory messages. "It was a joke," he replied flatly. "Don't be so sensitive." That word again. Sensitive. The word that shut down every attempt at honesty. Every feeling she had ever tried to explain. It was his escape hatch, a way to flip the blame to make her feel foolish for wanting to be seen. Evelyn didn't respond, not because she agreed, but because the conversation was already over. He didn't want to understand her. He wanted her to stop talking. When they got home, Richard went straight to the kitchen, poured himself a drink, and turned on the news. Evelyn walked upstairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman she had been for 30 years. The woman in the beautiful dress. The woman with the good posture and the practiced smile. The woman who kept trying to matter in a room she helped build. And for the first time, she didn't see herself. She saw an outline, a placeholder, a polite fixture in someone else's success story. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and realized something simple, something painful. She was no longer a partner. She was an accessory, and somewhere quietly with no ceremony and no audience. Evelyn began to disappear. It happened on a Tuesday. Not a thunderstorm of a day. Not a slam-door suitcase in the driveway kind of breakup. Just Tuesday. The sky was clear. The coffee had brewed on time, the neighbor's dog barked at nothing in particular, and Evelyn was folding laundry, his shirt still warm from the dryer when Richard stepped into the room and said it. "I think we need some space." She didn't move. One of his shirts was still in her hands halfway between the laundry basket and the bed. Her fingers curled around the fabric, suddenly unsure what to do with it. "Space," she repeated quietly. He nodded, avoiding her eyes. "We're in different places. It's been a while now. I think we've both felt it." The moment didn't come with betrayal or screaming or some dramatic reveal. It was delivered with the same tone someone might use to mention they were out of milk. Simple, flat, efficient. She wanted to ask if there was someone else. But the question felt redundant. She already knew. She had known for months, maybe longer, known it in the way his shirts began to smell different, the way his voice only carried warmth when talking to someone on the phone, the way his silence had gained a rhythm. Evelyn exhaled and placed the shirt down, smoothing it with the back of her hand. "Okay," she said. Just that. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She didn't ask if he would miss her. Because somewhere along the way, she'd already started saying goodbye, wordlessly, in increments. The house didn't resist her departure. That surprised her. You'd think a place where she'd memorized the creak of every floorboard would hold tighter. But no. It just sat there watching while she packed her life into boxes. She moved methodically, not with panic but with clarity. She didn't take much. Some framed photographs of the girls when they were small. Her mother's old recipe book, its pages yellowed and stained with time. A few favorite mugs, her easel, though she hadn't touched it in years. One folded blanket she had knitted the winter Lily got sick, and Richard worked late every night. Each item she placed in the boxes felt like an answer to a quiet question. What do I want to carry into my next life? She left behind the wedding album, the crystal vases from long-forgotten anniversaries, the expensive cookware Richard once insisted they needed but never used. She didn't need reminders of a life curated for appearances. She was choosing substance now. The girls reacted just as she expected. Lily, pragmatic and crisp, didn't blink. "Are you sure this is what you want, Mom?" she asked flatly. "You always seemed frustrated, as if her grief had been a mood, as if 30 years of fading into the wallpaper could be summarized by an adjective," Grace cried, she whispered. "I didn't know it was this bad." Evelyn didn't correct her. It wasn't her fault. Grace had grown up in the house of silence and survival, too young to hear what wasn't being said. Evelyn didn't ask either of them to come with her. She had spent a lifetime making room for others. Now she was learning how to make room for herself. The apartment in Savannah was humble. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten dinners. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The carpet carried old stains like faint memories. But it was hers. For the first time in decades, no one needed her to be anything. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't the background of someone else's success. She wasn't just mom. She was Evelyn. She hung 3 things on the wall: a watercolor painting Grace had made in middle school trees in bright, reckless green, a photo of herself holding Lily as a baby, both of them squinting in the sun, a blank canvas. That last one was not symbolic. Not yet. She didn't feel like painting. She didn't feel like anything, but she needed it there. A silent promise to herself that something could still begin. She spent the first few nights curled under a thrifted quilt, staring at the ceiling. The silence here was different. Not heavy, not expectant. Just honest. There was no TV murmuring in another room, no footsteps to listen for. Just her breath rising and falling, proof that she was still here, and in that stillness, she made herself a quiet vow. I will not disappear. Not in this place. Not in this chapter. Not again. The apartment was quiet in a way that sometimes felt like suffocation. At first, Evelyn welcomed it. The stillness was a relief after years of walking on eggshells of dinner tables filled with silence, too thick to chew. But as the days turned to weeks and the weeks slipped into months, she began to notice how loud the quiet could be when no one said your name anymore. She got a part-time job at a dental clinic. Receptionist, friendly face, soft voice, hair tied back. She answered phones, filed insurance forms, and asked people politely if they had flossed recently. No one knew her story there. No one called her Mrs. Whitman. She was just Evelyn, the woman at the front desk who always said thank you too quietly and ate lunch alone in the break room. Each evening she returned to the apartment, unlocked the door, and was greeted by nothing. No smell of dinner cooking. No footsteps overhead. Just the creak of the old radiator and the faint scent of dust. She left the TV on, not to watch it, but so the silence wouldn't swallow her whole. The voices laugh, tracks, news, anchors, old movies became her roommates. She learned to eat in slow, methodical bites. Soup toast, scrambled eggs, meals that didn't demand conversation. No one called Lily, didn't check in. Grace sent a few texts in the first few weeks, then stopped. Even the mail was sparse, just bills and catalogs she never requested. Sometimes Evelyn stood by the window and watched the street below. She told herself she was just observing the world go by, but the truth was simpler. She was waiting to feel like she existed. It wasn't depression exactly. It was numbness. A foggy gray space where she functioned, smiled, nodded. Did laundry, but no longer felt like she was occupying her own life. 6 months passed this way, quiet, mechanical, bleak. And then one Saturday afternoon, something shifted. It started with a box. She had finally decided to tackle the cluttered storage closet in the hallway. Most of it was untouched since she moved in labeled hastily with words like kitchen or old photos or simply Evelyn. The box that stopped her was one labeled Sam, her brother gone almost a year now. Heart attack, sudden and cruel. He'd been the only one to truly check in after the divorce. The one who brought wine and frozen meals when everyone else brought avoidance and silence. She sat on the floor and opened the box. Inside were his old flannel shirts, soft and worn, still faintly, carrying his cologne. A few sketches of woodworking plans he never finished. A copy of their mother's obituary. And tucked near the bottom inside a yellow envelope was something she hadn't expected to see. Her name in Sam's handwriting. Evelyn. Read when you're ready. Her hands shook. She sat still for a long moment before sliding her thumb under the flap. Inside were two things: a short note from Sam and a folded letter written in a different hand. Richards. She read Sam's message first. Sis, I found this while cleaning up after everything. I didn't know when or if I should give it to you. You looked so broken then, but you deserve to read it. Love, Sam. Her breath caught. She turned to the second paper. The ink was faded slightly, the edges worn. It hadn't been mailed, likely never even sealed, but the words were there. Whole, raw Richards' handwriting. The same one that had signed her birthday cards. The same one that had etched "I love you" at the bottom of their wedding vows. Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to say it aloud. I've done a lot of things wrong, but leaving you the way I did is what keeps me awake at night. I didn't stop loving you. I stopped loving the man I had become. And you reminded me of who I used to be. You never asked for more than I could give, but I took everything anyway. You gave me a home, a family, a life I didn't deserve. And I repaid you with distance. Tina didn't save me. She just didn't know me well enough to see how far I'd fallen. But you did, and that terrified me. You were never the problem, Evelyn. You were always the best part of my life. Richard. She didn't cry at first. She just stared. The letter sat on her lap like a ghost that had finally spoken. She read it again, slower, letting the words crawl into the quiet places she had sealed shut. It didn't change the past. It didn't fix the years she'd spent shrinking into someone forgettable. But it did something else. It told her she hadn't imagined it, that her love had mattered, that she had been seen, even if too late. She pressed the paper to her chest, her eyes closing. It wasn't closure, not exactly, it was truth. And sometimes truth is the only apology we ever get. She walked to her bookshelf and found a small wooden frame she had meant to use for a photo. Instead, she placed the letter behind the glass. Set it on the shelf beside a candle and a ceramic bird Sam once gave her for luck. That night, for the first time in months, she turned off the TV and let the silence stand on its own. This silence at least held something real. The letter sat quietly on the shelf beside Evelyn's window. Framed in a simple wooden border, it wasn't displayed for anyone else. No guests came to this apartment. No one dropped by for coffee or idle chatter. It wasn't framed for closure or for forgiveness, or as proof of anything. It was there because it grounded her. It told her that what she had lived had been real, that her version of the story mattered. And that in itself was a kind of freedom. Next to the frame, she had placed her old mug of paintbrushes, some stiff from disuse, others still soft. Behind them, the late afternoon sun angled through half-open blinds, warming the tin of peppermint tea she rarely drank but liked to keep close. The table had become an altar, not of worship, but of quiet return. A week later, Evelyn walked back into the community center. It had been almost 12 years. The place looked smaller than she remembered. The paint on the walls had faded to a dull beige, and the light above the entrance flickered as she walked in. But the smell was exactly the same: linoleum floors, turpentine, and the faint metallic hum of old plumbing. It was somehow still home. She passed a room where teenagers were hunched over sketchbooks, and another where a volunteer was leading Tai Chi for seniors. When she reached the third door on the left, a small placard read, Studio C. Her name had been freshly taped beneath it. Watercolor with Evelyn. Thursdays. She stood at the threshold for a beat, her heart tightening, not with fear but with the unfamiliar ache of beginning again. There were 5 women that first Thursday. They came in quietly, tote bags slung over shoulders, eyes guarded. Most were in their 60s, a few in their 70s. One had recently lost her husband. Another had just retired. One looked like she hadn't spoken aloud in days. They sat at folding tables covered in drop cloths, pulling out paint pans and sketchbooks older than Evelyn's daughters. The room was silent at first, save for the rustle of brushes and paper. Evelyn didn't start with color theory or brush techniques. Instead, she said, "There's no wrong way to begin. You're not here to paint masterpieces. You're here to feel your way back to yourselves." No one answered, but one of the women exhaled with such relief that Evelyn nearly cried. Over the following weeks, their numbers grew. 7, then 10. Word spread. A space where no one had to be impressive, just honest. Some brought cookies, some brought grief. All of them brought a kind of quiet hunger, not for art, but for room to exist, and Evelyn she brought herself, not the version who was once a wife or the one who had been erased in someone else's story. Just her, whole, tired, steady. One Thursday, after everyone had packed up, Evelyn remained behind. The studio was still. The sun had begun to set, and the light stretched across the hardwood floors like honey. She turned off the overhead fluorescents and stood in the glow of the window, facing a clean sheet of watercolor paper taped to an easel. She hadn't painted for herself in years, not since before the silence had started, not since before her worth had been chipped away. One shrug, one absence, one invisible wound at a time. She stared at the page, heart thudding not with fear but anticipation, as though some version of her was waiting just beyond the edges of the canvas, waiting to be remembered. She dipped a brush in water, then into a deep cerulean blue. Her first stroke bled across the page, irregular, uneven, bold. Then came ochre sienna and viridian green. There was no plan, no outline, no structure, just color moving through her hands, untethered from expectation. She let the paint run, let it blur and layer, let it mix where it wanted to. Her fingers trembled at times, not from weakness, but from awe. The same awe you feel when something dormant begins to breathe again. She didn't try to make anything beautiful. She made something true. That night she walked home without rushing. Savannah's streets glowed with porch lights and jasmine. A warm breeze tugged at her scarf. The city didn't notice her, but she noticed everything. The sound of her own footsteps, the rustle of live oaks, the way her chest didn't feel so tight anymore. She slept without the TV. She didn't need voices to drown the silence. She'd made peace with the quiet. It was no longer a void. It was her companion. The next morning she woke before sunrise, made tea, sat by the window with the light shifting slowly on the wall. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't scroll, didn't check who remembered her. Instead, she opened her sketchbook and painted 2 wide brushstrokes across the page. Then she smiled. Not for anyone. Not because someone watched. Just because it felt right. And then, to no one in particular, she said it again soft but with conviction. "I'm still here." It was no longer a question. It was a declaration, and this time she believed it. The letter had given Evelyn peace. The painting had given her breath, but neither had prepared her for the phone call that came 3 weeks later. It was Thomas Greer Richards' estate attorney. His voice was still as clipped and formal as she remembered. He asked politely but firmly if she would attend the official reading of Richard's will. Not as a guest, as a beneficiary. Evelyn sat very still, one hand resting on the rim of her tea mug. "Why now?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. "Because there are provisions in the amended will that involve you directly. They can't be executed without your presence." She didn't say yes, not immediately, but she didn't say no either. The conference room was nothing like the grand oak-paneled spaces people imagine when they think of legacy and power. It was beige, neutral, airless. A rectangular table, stiff leather chairs, and a long window that looked out over a parking lot. Evelyn walked in precisely on time. Claire was already seated back straight, lips pinched, dressed in a sleek black blazer-like armor. Lily sat beside her, flipping through her phone but not reading. Grace sat farther down, hands in her lap, shoulders hunched, eyes flickering between everyone, like she wasn't sure where to land. No one greeted Evelyn. She didn't expect them to. She took a seat opposite them. No fanfare. No righteousness. Just stillness. Thomas entered last, carrying a thick folder and a tired expression. He adjusted his glasses and opened the file with a soft rustle. "Thank you for being here. This is the final reading of Richard Whitman's last will and testament, including his most recent amendments dated June 17th. No one breathed. Even the air paused. Thomas cleared his throat. To Evelyn Whitman he began. Claire's head jerked. Lily froze mid-scroll. Grace looked directly at her mother for the first time in what felt like years. Thomas continued. The Charleston property located at 1826 Waxford Lane shall transfer in full to Evelyn Whitman. The estate's remaining mortgage was paid in advance by the deceased. Claire's knuckles whitened. And furthermore, he went on. The Martin Whitman Creative Arts Fund, established to support women over 50 pursuing careers in the arts, is to be managed and directed by Evelyn Whitman. The fund has been valued at $480,000. No one spoke. The silence was a second wave thicker than the first. Claire blinked rapidly. "There must be a mistake," she said, her voice thin. That house he promised Thomas looked up. Expression unchanged. All documents were notarized and confirmed by the probate court. They are valid and uncontestable. Still silence, until he reached into the folder again. There is also a personal letter. Richard requested it be read aloud at this meeting. He unfolded a single page and began to read. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. If Evelyn is in the room, it means she's stronger than I ever gave her credit for, though I always knew it deep down. Claire, I thank you for your companionship in my final years. But you came into my life after the foundation was already laid. That foundation was Evelyn Lily Grace. Your mother gave up more than either of you will ever fully understand. She made a life out of very little. She held us all together with things you didn't see because she never made you look. If you're angry today, I ask you to sit with it, to look at the woman across from you and know this. She deserves everything I couldn't give her when it mattered. This is my way of trying, even if it's too late." Thomas folded the letter and set it down. No one spoke. Claire stood first, abrupt, stiff, and gathered her purse with more force than necessary. She didn't look at Evelyn. Didn't look at anyone. She walked out, heels clicking sharply down the hall, retreating like a queen without a crown. Lily sat, frozen lips parted, a flush rising in her cheeks. She didn't say a word. But Grace. Grace turned toward her mother, eyes filled with something Evelyn hadn't seen since she was a child. Recognition. She didn't speak either, but she nodded. Just once. A small, tremulous nod that said, "I see you now." Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply gathered her bag, stood, and whispered to the room. Not in volume, but in truth. "I didn't come to take anything. I came to be heard." Then she walked out. Shoulders, square steps steady back into the afternoon light, where for the first time in years she no longer needed to explain who she was. The hydrangeas had bloomed again. Big, bold, unruly clusters of blue and violet. They lined the edge of the Charleston house like memories refusing to be trimmed back. Evelyn knelt beneath them, pruning gently, careful not to cut too much, letting them grow wild, the way she always had. The sun filtered through the garden gate, and the air smelled faintly of damp soil and honeysuckle. That's when she heard the car door close. She didn't look up right away. Part of her didn't want to hope, but the footsteps coming up the gravel were light familiar. She wiped her hands on her apron, slowly stood and turned toward the gate. Grace, her younger daughter, stood on the path, hands in the pockets of a denim jacket, hair tied back in a loose bun, eyes wide and uncertain but not afraid. "Hey," Grace said. "Hey," Evelyn replied, voice even gentle. "No, tremble, no rush. Just breath and truth." They stood there for a moment, unsure who should move first. Then Evelyn pushed open the side gate with one hand and motioned toward the porch. "Want to sit?" Grace nodded. They settled on the old wicker bench, the one Evelyn and Richard once bought at a flea market when Lily was still in diapers. The cushion sagged more than it used to, but it still held. They didn't touch, didn't rush to fill the silence. Birds chirped in the crepe myrtle above them, and somewhere inside the house a clock chimed softly. "I didn't know you'd come back," Evelyn said after a while. "I didn't know either," Grace admitted. Another pause, then she added, "I drove by last week. Didn't stop. Just needed to see it." Evelyn nodded. She understood. Sometimes we need to circle what hurts before we dare to land. Grace looked down at her hands, then around the porch. Her gaze landed on the front window, and something inside shifted. "Is that?" She began standing slightly. She moved to the window, peered through, then turned back. "That's my old painting." Evelyn followed her gaze. The watercolor of wild green trees painted when Grace was maybe 10 hung beside the staircase, slightly faded edges warped from years spent in storage. But still there. "I never threw it out," Evelyn said. "I kept it, even when I didn't know if you'd ever come back." Grace sat again, blinking fast. "I forgot. It even existed. I didn't." The quiet between them thickened, not with tension, but with things unsaid. Years of missed birthdays, unanswered texts, silences chosen for survival. Evelyn rested her hands in her lap, thumbs brushing slowly. "I wrote you a letter once," she said softly, "and one for Lily, too." Grace looked up. "I never sent them," Evelyn continued, "not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose." Grace's throat tightened. "I wish you had sent it. I wish I hadn't needed to." Evelyn replied with a faint smile. They looked at each other, then really looked, not through the fog of anger, not through years of loyalty divided between two parents, but woman to woman, human to human, both carrying truth, both carrying hurt, neither trying to win. No one said, "I'm sorry." No one needed to. Grace reached over and took her mother's hand. It was smaller than she remembered. Warmer. They sat like that for a while, hands clasped loosely, the wind catching the edges of Evelyn's scarf and lifting it like a soft breath. Then Grace asked almost shyly, "Do you still paint?" Evelyn nodded. "Almost every day." Grace paused. "Would it be weird if I came by sometime, maybe painted with you?" Evelyn turned her head slowly, met her daughter's eyes. "No, it wouldn't be weird." Grace smiled a little. Crooked, a little unsure, but real. "Okay then," she said. "Deal." They didn't hug. They didn't cry into each other's shoulders. There was no dramatic swell of music or sweeping words of reconciliation. But as Grace stood to leave and Evelyn walked her to the gate, they both knew something old had shifted, something silent had healed, and that more than apology, more than resolution was what real return looked like. The house was no longer heavy. It had taken time longer than Evelyn expected, but the walls had softened. The rooms breathed differently. The quiet no longer echoed. It simply rested like a cat curled in a sunlit corner. She had repainted the guest bedroom. Sage green, soft and grounding. It was now her studio, her reading nook, her place. A single chair by the window, a small shelf of books, a side table with a teacup that never stayed full for long, and near the wall her easel always waiting, never demanding. She opened her home to others again, not for parties, not for show, but for something truer. Every other Saturday, a handful of women came for her watercolor workshops. No flyers, no websites, just word of mouth. A neighbor, a cousin, a woman who hadn't picked up a brush in 40 years but couldn't stop thinking about the time she used to draw in the margins of recipe books. They came with trembling hands, and Evelyn greeted each of them by name. One morning after the women had left and the room still smelled faintly of paint and citrus, Evelyn found a folded note on her kitchen table. It was handwritten, delicate cursive. "Thank you for seeing us, for making space. I used to think I was invisible. Now, I know I was just waiting for the right light. Marianne. Evelyn smiled, tucked the note inside her journal, and ran her fingers across the table where paint had dried in faint swirls. She didn't need applause, but gratitude, quiet and honest, felt like a new kind of belonging. Spring came slowly. The rains softened the soil. The sunlight shifted warmer, brighter, less tentative, and one morning Evelyn stepped into the garden with her cup of tea and saw it, a single bloom. The hydrangea had returned. She knelt beside it carefully, fingertips brushing the petals. Blue, brilliant, stubborn, defiant. The first blossom she'd seen in over a decade. It wasn't just a flower. It was a marker of what endured, of what grew anyway, of what refused to stay buried. She sat on the porch, tea in hand, watching the wind move through the leaves. The house behind her no longer felt like a reminder of what was lost. It felt like a reward for what had survived. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the last of the light poured into the reading room, Evelyn picked up her pen and wrote the final line in her journal. Not to explain anything, not to forgive anyone, but to say something she now knew in her bones. I don't need anyone to forgive me. To be myself, I only need to remember I was always here. And with that, she closed the journal. Not with a period, but with peace.